Welcome everybody to a new program of Thousand of Words. How are you? It is a pleasure that you can join us just every Friday. In this opportunity, we will be dealing with fairy tale and if we should continue writing and telling fairy tales in the 21st century. So before we start, let me introduce you our guest for today. The first guest was born in England, grew up surrounded by books, and always wanted to be a writer from an early age. At just 11, she wrote her first novel, and in 1990, she conceived the idea of Harry Potter while sitting on a delight train from Manchester to London King's Cross. Over the next 5 years, she began to map out all 7 books of this magnificent series. Welcome, please, Joanne Rowling.
Hello, Valerie. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Our second guest was born in Wales, but he, since her 15th, has been living in England. She is a primary school teacher, and now she's working as a kindergarten teacher at Westminster School. Welcome, please, Miss Christine Hughes.
Thank you, Valerie. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Welcome. So, as I have mentioned, today's topics are fairy tales. So, Joanne, tell me please, what do you think about this? Should we keep writing and telling fairy tales in 21st century?
Well, Valerie, as you said, I think that we all have a fairy tale that remains in our hearts, right? They are usually connected to our childhood, but the reason why I think we should continue writing and telling these kind of stories is because they, we take them into our maturity as a part of our identity. And that is very important. They also share something that crosses cultural boundaries, which is good triumphs over evil. And going into a more detailed analysis of fairy tales, I will say that they include short passages and simple vocabulary, and also they are linear and chronological, which makes them quite easy to follow.
Well, Christy, taking that into account, what can you tell me about? Do you agree with her opinion?
Well, I think that we can use other tales or fables for entertainment, and that has a more moral point. Or novels, which there is no explicitly supernatural elements in it. But we need to take care of fairy tales that contains or hides supernatural happenings. The same term fairy derives from Old French, meaning enchantment or magic. People believe that fairy tales boost children's imagination and optimism, while setting their morals and teaching them what is good and bad. However, fairy tales often have hidden messages, which might influence children in negative ways, lower their self-esteem, and affect the way they think. They usually set unrealistic expectations of life, which could induce disappointment in children's future. They also create false worlds, where everything seems to work out perfectly, and lead to the notion of living happily ever after, when we all are aware that life is not a bed of roses, and everyone has to face hardships. Some statistics say that 50% of teenager girls fear that they are not good enough to fit into today's society. In a study done, it was found that in the main cause of this self-doubt is the unrealistic body image that are constantly being shown on television and movies and that we can read in books. With unrealistic ideas come unrealistic expectations, and with that comes the disappointment. And nothing good comes from that. When it comes down to it, kids still need to hear the truth. They can grow up expecting a fairy tale, no matter how magical and happy they may be, because they set bad examples for children and give them improbable ideas of what their future will hold. Reality is now, is the real world. Reality is what kids should expect from their future. Because in the end, fairy tales are only things you read about in books. We need to prepare our kids for reality.
So, Christine, what are you trying to say is that the problem is that fairy tales maybe portray unreal ideas of a perfect life or happiness, for example?
Yes.
And I think maybe people will be concerned, especially for the idea of happiness that fairy tales mostly portray, that it's generally depending on good looking, money, or also marriage to live happily ever after, no? Doesn't it? So, Joanne, what can you tell me about that idea of marriage that is portrayed in fairy tales?
Well, it is true that typical fairy tales understood marriage as the only thing that would make the characters happy and that will lead them to this concept of happily ever after. We have Cinderella, for example, in which the protagonist is a woman because this idea of happiness related to marriage was especially thought for women. This girl, her only goal is to marry this prince who was thought as some kind of savior. But we should be fair and recognize that society changed and so did fairy tales. Nowadays, we have these contemporary adaptations in which they include more girl-centered plots and women's empowerment. So we have examples such as the stories Vayambara, written in 1980, and even though it does not include all the characteristics of a typical fairy tale, the title itself means the choosing of a husband by the bride herself, which is something that we don't usually see in fairy tales. And also, it shows conception of marriage more related to partnership than with the relation of dependence, that it is more typical of, let's say, yes, fairy tales, and it is usually shown through socioeconomic terms. For example, the women marries the prince and becomes princess and a part of the royalty. But fairy tales had to keep up with these transformations, obviously, and it's okay because otherwise they will become old-fashioned. But as long as we can rethink these gender roles and other concepts such as discrimination, as long as we can rethink them, we can continue writing and telling fairy tales.
So, what can you tell me about children, for example, being influenced by those characters, personalities, or attitudes on fairy tales?
We need to be careful with who our kids imitate. They need to know what's right and what's wrong, what's real, what's not, so we can guide them correctly.
Oh, but children can also identify and relate to positive characters, right? In my story, The Fountain of Fair Fortune, which as Svayambara, it is not a typical fairy tale. We have these three witches and a knight who show the importance of helping each other to overcome difficulties, and this story focuses more into the idea of friendship rather than in romantic love.
Well, sorry, and correct me if I'm wrong, but going back to the idea of marriage, there is one in the story, right?
Yes.
So they'll still put emphasis on love, and they only have other perspectives, but nothing has changed.
Sorry, as regards what you said before, Joan, could you explain how these stories have changed nowadays?
Well, yeah, what has changed is that the plot doesn't hang on the idea of marriage. It is not crucial for the story to be made. It is only the result of, let's say, this knight recovering his self-confidence. And let me stop there and tell you that this story shows how you should not doubt your abilities and that you should know that you are capable. So if these kind of stories can give such messages, then why should we stop writing them?
So, Joan, what can you say about the roles which are expected to be represented by the characters? As Props explains, it is usual for typical fairy tales to include a hero, a villain, a princess, or a donor. But does it always has to be like that? Or, I mean, is a condition for a story to be a fairy tale?
Well, there is a well-known phrase which is do not judge a book by its cover, right? And we can see that again in my story, The Fountain of Fair Fortune. In typical fairy tales, for example, witches are portrayed as the evil character, the villain who wants to cause harm to the good ones. But this is not the case. Here we have these anti-heroic characters that show us the importance to keep keep an open mind and to be ready to let aside our preconceptions of who should fulfill each role now. And that's another valuable lesson for life, right?
Well, I agree with the lessons for life and a moral point of view, with the focus on character traits and not on the characterization. Why do I say that? Because fairy tales writers might facilitate our perception of our own world as magical by refraining from explicit spatiotemporal staging or by providing an impression of temporal and spatial distance between the reader that's writing and the story, and this isn't real.
So, well, you have mentioned magic, and I have read that is one of the main characteristics of this genre. Don't you think, that it's important for children when developing their imagination and creativity?
Well, magic is one of the main characteristics of this subgenre for children's literature, but as I said before, I'm against it, and I believe that we can use other stories to develop their imagination and creativity. In the case of Svayambara, it's a great story because we have a lesson for life without including magic or fantasy. But in the case of the werewolf story, it has magic, but I think it isn't for kids. It's more a supernatural horror tale for adults. Talking about this, during the first part of the 20th century, all these stories or referred to as ghost stories, even if they don't have any ghost in it. And this is not something for kids. The story talks about supernatural creatures varying from good to evil, just as humans do, and which is set in a world very similar to us, but it's not quite our own. And it uses first a narrator vocalizer and then a character vocalizer, and kids can have problems understanding that.
Well, fairy tales broaden our vocabulary and imagination, and we also need to remember that magic in fairy tales is used in a more agent-free sense, right? If a world is magic, then it is what it is, and no one makes it magic. So we have, for example, again, my story, The Fountain of Fair Fortune, in which, yes, the world is magic, but the fountain, which is the reason why the characters set on this adventure to get fortune, has a placebo effect, right? So the characters solve the problems with their own common sense and ingenious, but without this idea they had of the magic, they would have never believed that they were capable of overcoming their current situations. So even if we don't have this magic that the fairy godmother uses to give Cinderella the beautiful dress, and so magic can be crucial for other stories to develop. Is it that bad to let kids dream about these fantasy lands? Adults are the ones who face the harsh reality of life, right? Children can't wait until that time comes.
Well, very interesting point. Thank you very much. So, ladies, we have to go. It's time to finish. I want to say thank you very much for coming. And I would like to conclude that fairy tales are quite important and can be useful, not only for children, but also for adults, because I think that everybody may learn through reading something instead. Also, fairy tales fosters the creativity, imagination, and helps the develop of vocabulary. But we should be cautious because many times the lessons that they gave, particularly regarding discrimination or gender roles, the key of the happiness, for example, and I think that it's important to consider different perspectives when reading. So, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.